joining me for the Farmer to Farmer podcast, episode 3. This is your host, Chris Blanchard. We've got a great episode for you today with my guest, Allen Philo. Allen spent a number of years working on some very interesting farms. Now he works as a soils consultant, specializing in diversified vegetable farms with Midwestern Bio Ag, a biological farming company based out of Blue Mounds, Wisconsin. Allen has a really down-to-earth way of explaining the way soils and plants work together to make great food. The other really cool thing about Allen is he used to be a monk. He was actually a farming monk, and that's, we're going to get into that later on in the show.
Well, I'm really happy to be here today talking to you. And the way that I originally kind of got started with agriculture was not the way that you would expect. I grew up in central Iowa, just surrounded by, just thousands and thousands of acres of agriculture and didn't have anything to do with it. Growing up, like so many other people, I think in my generation, kind of what happened is, we're like a generation removed from the farm. Like my mom's generation didn't farm, but if you go one generation back from that, well, we were still on like the farm that we settled on when we first moved out to Iowa. But I didn't grow up doing anything with farming, and so here I am in the middle of like this absolutely gorgeous agricultural setting. And I ended up having to move to West Virginia to start learning about farming, which is not, the first place that comes to mind when you start thinking about agriculture and farming. And so what it was that I actually was at a monastery for about 5 years. And as part of what I was doing there, I got put in charge of a couple different things. And one of them was the monastery garden, and the other one was our monastery goat herd. And because we milked goats and we made goat's milk soap, and I started making cheese, and I started just reading everything I could possibly get my hands on about the soil and how soil worked and how farming worked, because the soil out there, of course, is really different from what we have here in the Midwest.
It ain't Iowa, that's for sure.
It's definitely not Iowa. Iowa, what I tell people is where I grew up, if I went to my backyard and dug, I couldn't ever figure out why somebody would go buy potting soil, because that was what you would dig up in the backyard. And so it's just like this disconnect in my head between, I don't understand what this whole potting soil industry is about when that's what soil is in the backyard. And
right.
Never realized how great that was until I got to West Virginia, and I realized that what you have out there is this very old, highly weathered soil that's also been highly eroded, and it's like red clay, and it's impossible to dig through, and it becomes waterlogged really easily. And so that kind of started me on this whole journey about, well, how do I understand why that soil I grew up on is so different from this soil that I'm out here on? And one of the first books I ever got a hold of was John Jevons' book, How to Grow More Vegetables on Less Land Than You Ever Imagined Possible.
Right.
And it's a great book. And actually, when people ask me for books to read, that's one of the books I often recommend to them if they haven't done a lot of reading, because it gives you this, even though some of the things in that book might not be totally technically correct, it gives you this really great starting place on how soils work, how soil testing works, propagation techniques, planting techniques, some of the math just involved in how you figure out, square feet area, acres, et cetera.
It really is kind of packed with I mean, I started with that book too. That was one of the two that I began with when I started working in agriculture. And it really is just, it's packed with everything. I mean, it's got all of the details and all the nitty gritty about, even like down to how long do you water and what do you look for on the surface of the soil before you know that it's time to quit watering. I mean, those kinds of details that are just invaluable. And I didn't think about it from the soil's perspective, but obviously you did.
Well, and I think a lot of it that really spoke to me was, he talks about these farms that they start with in California that are on these heavy clays and what they're able to do with them over time to get them to be these highly productive soils. And I was like, oh, well, I have heavy clay, and so this is really applicable to me. But I mean, even when I go out to plant like my little home garden, I still get out the charts in the back of that book for my spacing. Because I use 5x20 beds for my home garden. And so I still have that book. It's by now it's all ratty and it's dirty and has water stains all over it because I have it out in the garden with me. And, but I still use that book. And that was one of the first books I really, latched onto. And then I basically just started going through like the Acres library. And I had like the Moses library, and I would just order books and just read all these books. And I was also doing, the goats and studying grazing. And so another great book, if you're into grazing, this foundational book by Andre Voisin, is this French biochemist in the 1930s, and the book is called Grass Productivity, and it's still the foundational book about anything having to do with rotational grazing. But it's beautifully laid out. It's very easy to read and understand. And so that's I just started educating myself about, these different practices that you could do, how to make compost, how to do tillage properly, what cover crops do to the soil. And then I was at the monastery for about 5 years and got to this point where I decided that wasn't what I wanted to do, and I moved back to the Midwest. And it wasn't the greatest time to move back to the Midwest.
Hold on, Alan. I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt here because, I mean, it's a farming show, but it's also about people. I think about being in a monastery. It doesn't feel to me like that's like the kind of thing that you're just like, oh yeah, I decided I wasn't going to do that anymore. I mean, when you were there, were you a monk or were you just living at the monastery?
No, I was a monk. I never took final vows, but it was an Eastern Orthodox monastery. And so what I was technically, it's called a Rasifor monk. So it's sort of like you're not like a novice. You're not just there for a little bit. Like you've been there for about 3 or 4 years, but you haven't necessarily decided that this is, that you're going to make the commitment to stay here for the rest of your life. So I was kind of in this intermediate stage, but it just, and that's the reason that you don't necessarily take final vows, right away, is that you stay in the monastery and you kind of enter this interim period where you're given a lot more responsibility. And it just kind of got to this point where I was like, I just don't think this is what I want to do with my life. So it was time to move on. And I moved back to the Midwest where my family was located. So that's the short version.
Great. So. I'm sure we could do a whole show on this, but I don't think that would be, we'd be probably pretty far outside of the agricultural realm by then. So
I think we probably would. Although if you ever wanted to get into the whole history of the effect of monasteries and monasticism of farming and keeping farming traditions alive, especially through the Dark Ages, is actually, if you wanted to do some sort of historical podcast, it's pretty fascinating. But I moved back to the Midwest. It wasn't the greatest time to do that. It was 2008, right when the recession was starting. And just moved back and started looking for a job, and had learned enough and taught myself enough that a position at Gardens of Eagan, which is a large, a fairly large organic wholesale vegetable farm just south of Minneapolis, St. Paul, they had a position open for a field operations manager, which basically meant they needed somebody to come down and kind of like manage tillage operations, planning, cover cropping, and fertility. And I was like, well, I'll take a shot. And I I filled out the job application, and Linda Holly, who's still the farm manager there, had this whole series of questions that she asked about different things like, what does sustainability mean to you? And I wrote these fairly long responses to these questions. And before I knew it, Linda called me and offered me the job, which was very generous on her end, because living in West Virginia, I had taught myself a lot about these various things, but I ran a tractor and all sorts of equipment out there, but I had never run, like big tillage equipment, getting on top of a tractor and running like an 18-foot disc was not something I had done before. So yeah, I feel like she kind of made a leap of faith with me, but I applied myself and I learned fast and got to this, what I was really doing there was managing, basically like we had about 60 different fields and we had about 12 different crops.
And this is on how can you remind me how big Gardens of Eagan is or was at that point?
So at that point, they've moved since I was there, and the farm that they were farming at the time was the original Gardens of Eagan farm. Well, not the original Gardens of Eagan farm. It was actually the second iteration of Gardens of Eagan that Martin and Atina Diffley had created. Once they were kind of developed out of Eagan, they moved down to Northfield, and so they had purchased about 100 acres.
Okay. And
there was about 60 acres that were tilled. And I would say of that, about 50 acres cropped in a given season. It's been a little bit of time since I've seen those figures, but so I was managing, probably what was, easily 40 to 50 fields of all of varying sizes, 12 different crops, sequentially planted throughout the year because, we were a wholesale operation. So what we were doing was, trying to make sure that we always had enough to do like 160 20-pound boxes of broccoli, a week or twice a week at the height of the season, and to be able to ship that out. So, that operation, we started planting broccoli like April 18th, and we did our final planting of broccoli, I think sometime in early July.
Okay.
And, at harvest broccoli, I'm picking on broccoli because that was one of our main crops, and that's the easiest one to kind of use as a gauge in my mind for how the timing of the season worked. And so we were picking broccoli basically from sometime in June all the way up to Thanksgiving. And so that was a pretty complex system to kind of get your head around to make sure that, we're going to be planting 5 or 6 more fields over here next week. And, but we still want to have all this ground covered with like a cover crop. And what cover crop is going to be the best cover crop for this crop that's coming up? And what are we going to plant there like 2 years from now? It really taught me a lot about, I have to be thinking like 2 to 5 years ahead on all this ground in order to make these rotations work and to avoid diseases and to, reduce pest pressures and to make sure the fertility is right.
Right.
And at that time, I also started working with Mike Loveland from Midwestern Bio Ag. And Linda had a long relationship with Gary Zimmer, the founder of Midwestern Bio Ag, because when she was at Harmony Valley, Gary was basically their soils consultant, their soils and fertility consultant.
Right.
And so she had this very long relationship with him. And so when I got there, she put me in. She just said, "Well, you're Mike Loveland's contact." And every once in a while, Gary would kind of show up on the farm, because he knew him and Linda are good friends, and he was kind of curious about what was happening out there. And sometimes he'd just show up to talk to Martin and Atina, who were still living on the farm. And whenever he would come by, I would grab him. And I'd be like, come on, we have to go like look at different stuff in the field. Because I was like, here's this guy that is really well respected. One of the first things I did once I got to Gardens of Eagan was read Gary's books.
Right. Because he is kind of he's the guy when it comes to this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So the biological farmer was the one he had out at the time. And since then he's published Advancing Biological Farming. And so what ended up happening was I started to kind of get to know Gary, but then Mike Loveland really got interested in what I was doing with cover crops, because I kind of got to go crazy at Gardens of Eagan. I just got to experiment with all these different things, because there were a couple of things that had been done there for a long time, like using hairy vetch or using some, annual cereal rye in the winter to do some soil stabilization. But, there was a decent amount of the farm that was bare going into winter. And we weren't doing a lot with having like some set aside ground that was just going to get like rebuilt for a year, So I was really getting to experiment with a lot of different mixes. And Mike Loveland asked me if I would come over and just talk about what I was doing with cover crops at one of these like consultant meetings. So these are meetings that Midwestern Bio Ag has basically to just help train consultants, and they like to bring farmers or people from outside the company in to just talk about what they're doing and their perspective on
a little
things.
bit of cross-pollination and fertilization of their own there.
Right. And so I was like, oh, okay, I'll come over and do that. And that was after the first year that I was working at GUE. And so I traveled over there and I spoke, and it went really well, and had some really long conversations with Gary Zimmer at that point, and just kind of kept this thing going where he was kind of like, if you ever want to come over here and work for me, we really need somebody that understands and does things with vegetables, because they're, Midwestern Bio Ag's foundation was really in like dairy nutrition, working with alfalfa, and then row crops.
Right. And selling and really thinking about things in terms of fairly, what have oftentimes been fairly low margin enterprises with pallet loads of fertilizer being shipped to them, or truckloads even.
Yeah. And, and fairly like easy to understand operations. I mean,
right.
A dairy farm is probably like the most complex you're going to get, in a sense, because, well, maybe the guy's going to he's got alfalfa, he's got some, alfalfa that's going to maybe go for hay or baleage, and then he's got a pasture system over here, and he's going to be making some corn silage, and then he's maybe got some regular field corn, and maybe he's doing some soybeans. So maybe you're up to like 4 different things, but actually if you look at it, some of those things are pretty similar.
Right.
Pasture and alfalfa, that you're getting kind of similar there. The difference between corn silage and like regular field corn is not that huge in terms of planting time and things like that. So that's a fairly easy system to wrap your head around. And he was kind of always like, I don't know, we kind of don't know what to do with some of these operations, like a CSA operation or just a market farm where you've got 5 acres and 40 different vegetables and 120 different varieties. It's like, oh my gosh, what do you do with that? How do you start wrapping your head around those kind of fertility needs?
And we're going to talk about that. That's coming up here. So
yeah,
okay,
yeah, we're going to get into that. So he kind of always kind of intimated to me like, you can come over here and at some point and be interested in hiring you. And so it just kind of in the interim there, I got married, and we were at a point where we wanted to start a family. I'd worked for about 3 years at Gardens of Eagan. And I think part of it too is I didn't want to take Gary up on his offers too soon, because I felt like there was a lot more I had to learn in order to be able to be out there giving other people advice. But that sort of also happened kind of organically in a way, because Mike Loveland ended up getting these calls like from Featherstone Farms, Jack Hayden, and he's just kind of like, I kind of don't feel like I should be down there on my own. Would you just be willing to do some independent consulting down here? Because in the meantime, Gary had also offered to send me through their like training program for free, which is just because Gary Zimmer is a very generous guy. And so I went over there for a week and I went through MBA's training program. And so Mike felt like he could call me because I was somebody that already understood what MBA was going to be doing. And so I ended up like going down there, not working for Midwestern Bio Ag, but already starting to do some consulting, at Featherstone Farms. And so that was a real natural segue into finally just taking a job with Midwestern Bio Ag, because I was already starting to work with some of their clientele on on a private basis.
Right.
So it came over, and since then, so that was about 3 years ago. Now that's happened, and since then, the first year or two was really just kind of getting my feet under me and getting to know the CSA farming community. I travel everywhere from the Twin Cities all the way over to Ontario, working with different farms and acting as really a support person for over a large part of that area. I'm a support person for our consultants, but I handle personally a lot of the CSAs and market farms that we deal with around the Madison area and all the way up kind of towards the Twin Cities a little bit. So a lot of what I've been doing in that time is really just trying to develop a better way for us to work with these small farms, and also to develop easy systems for farmers to use to be able to understand and think about what the fertility needs are on their farm. And
especially in these really complex situations.
Right, especially in these really complex situations. And then in addition to that, Midwestern Bio Ag asked me to go back and actually finish a degree in the agricultural field. So I'm doing that simultaneously as well. So I'm actually presently in my about last year and a half of schooling at University of Wisconsin Madison campus with a soils degree. So that's been going on all at the same time.
Wow.
So yeah. So and did I also mention that in the meantime, we bought a farm?
Because you didn't have enough else on your plate.
That's right. But sometimes people ask why is it that you're doing all this? And it's really funny because in the end, this all gets started because what you want is a farm. And for me, it goes one step further. I want to farm with horses, so it's like when you look back at what's the root cause of all these decisions that led me to become an MBA consultant and send me back to school. Well, it's all because I'm trying to do these things that will allow me to farm.
Right.
And so finally we get the farm, and then you're like, oh, I don't have any time to farm. But we moved in there about a year ago and just spent a lot of time working on the house. And this next year we're just gonna, be increasing. We're going to be doing a small layer hen operation.
Very cool.
In conjunction with a friend of mine, who's farming in the area, John Middleton and Luigi Dunge from Fazenda Boa Terra. They have a CSA operation. We're going to provide some eggs for them, and then we're going to do some pigs. And that's kind of going to be the extent of that. And then we're working on bringing the ground back under tillage, and probably trying to get a long-term hay stand established on my tillable acreage, and that's a whole nother thing. So we got a lot going on, but it's all around agriculture. It's all around soils, and while I've personally made the decision that I probably will never farm vegetables, that is what my role is at Midwestern Bio Ag, is working with vegetable farmers and specialty crop farmers and trying to help people understand those needs. And yeah.
So, one of the things, you just brought this up. Vegetable farmers have special needs around fertility that are different than what you would run into with a row crop type operation or a dairy type operation. What are the top challenges that you're seeing for vegetable growers, and what are the ways that they're meeting those?
So one of the first things is honestly just the complexity of the operations. When you get to those kind of numbers, I don't care if you've got 120 acres or you have 5 acres. If you're going to be growing, 40 different vegetables, you can't run 40 different fertility regimes, because each of these plants kind of has its own fertility needs. To just give you an example, you look at what, and the numbers I'm going to be quoting here, assuming that you don't have any fertility in your soil. Let's say you were just going to grow on sand, but that's a really great way to think about this, to compare one plant to another. Right.
Okay.
So if I'm going to go plant broccoli or sweet corn, which are actually very similar, to get that crop, I'm going to need somewhere between like 100 to 150 pounds of nitrogen, 40 to 60 pounds of phosphorus
per acre.
Yep. And, somewhere around 120 to 150 pounds of potassium. That's what it's going to be required to grow that crop. But then you turn around and you look at something like a tomato plant. Well, some of those needs look pretty similar. Maybe 120 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 40 to 80 pounds of phosphorus. But then you look at the potassium needs, and the potassium needs are 300 pounds per acre. So they're double, almost triple what like the broccoli or sweet corn needs are.
Right.
And there's a lot of like little subtle variations, even between plants that are, fairly similar. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So one of the first things that I, try to do with farmers is to get them to understand, you can't handle, 40 different crops. You can't think of it as 40 different crops. We got to condense this down. And most of those crops belong to crop families that have fairly similar nutrient needs.
Your brassicas or your solanaceous or...
Exactly. Yeah. And even some of the crops that maybe aren't in what we would consider the same crop family, they're similar types of crops, and so they have similar needs. Greens, a lot of root crops have very similar nutrient needs, even though their carrots and rutabagas aren't in the same family, but they have very similar needs. So that's one of the first things I do. So we try to divide it up, and the way I divide it up is you already mentioned a couple of them: brassicas, solanaceous, cucurbits, greens, root crops. Sometimes if people are growing a lot of them, I'll separate alliums out as a separate cropping family. And then you have a couple kind of like weird outliers, like potatoes, even though they're technically a solanaceous plant, don't behave like the other solanaceous plants. So we're on a kind of a different fertility program for potatoes. But already what that kind of does is it gets you from trying to think of 40 different things to only thinking of 7 or 8. Now that's a lot easier to wrap your head around.
Right. So and that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense that you would look at it that way.
And so that's kind of the first level. Cucurbits. I don't know if I mentioned cucurbits. Cucurbits are in there as well. And cucurbits are actually a really interesting one to kind of get into a little bit. There are still some subtle variations, even within these families. You'll get these cucumbers don't need like as much potassium or even really as much nitrogen as if you say watermelons do. And that's because these plants are, it's the way the plants and the fruits that you're harvesting are really different in their makeup. You think like when I bite into a cucumber, there's a little bit of sweetness there, but there aren't really it's not like I'm eating a melon.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, right. And there's no seeds there. I mean, you might have little pips, but you're not having fully developed seeds like you do in a watermelon either, right?
Right. And so these differences in the things that we're actually tasting even inside this similar crop family are actually indicative of some of the different nutrient needs of these plants. And I think a little bit later on here, we'll get into a little bit of some of the plant physiology where when you really start to dig into it, there are even ways that you can think about, here's what this plant tastes like. Here's what I'm harvesting. This directly relates to the nutrient needs of the plants. Back to this, just trying to divide things up. One of the nice things is once we get things down to this level of, okay, maybe we only have like 7 different families to think of. What you start to notice is even that some of those families are really closely related in the ratios of the nutrient needs. So when I say ratios of the nutrient needs, I'm talking a lot about like how much nitrogen does the plant need compared to the amount of potassium the plant needs, right?
Right.
So back to the broccoli tomato comparison, broccoli kind of needs nitrogen to potassium at about a 1-to-1 ratio. About 150 pounds, 120 pounds of nitrogen, about 120 pounds of potassium. Right? 1-to-1.
Right.
You look at tomatoes, 100 to 120 pounds of nitrogen, 300 pounds of potassium. That's 1-to-3. And what you'll notice is that the plants also in these plant families kind of divide themselves up into most things want that 1-to-1 ratio. And then there's a few things, and they're almost all in the solanaceous family, that need that 1 to 3. And so that gives us another way to think about how you're going to, do fertility, because that kind of gets to the point now where now, instead of having, let's say I was going to make like a different blend of fertility for every single vegetable. Well, we went from 40 to 7, and now we're at 2. Right. You can use one thing to fertilize these things that need 1 to 1, and one thing that needs a 1 to 3. And that, I think it was about when I got to that, I realized, this is actually doable. Like we can really give farmers targeted fertility towards the actual plant needs if I think of it in this way.
Now, Alan, I don't want to take you and veer you off here, but when you talk about the fertility, now that's different than the soil building, right? You guys at Midwest Bio Ag, you kind of think of those as two separate processes. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And that actually gets to another really interesting point. Like another big challenge. Well, I'm going to talk about this challenge first, and then I'll do a better job of answering your question. One of the other big challenges when you're dealing with a lot of vegetable crops is the root zone on vegetable crops. So if you think of like a corn crop, there's this really great, I wish, of course, this is a podcast, so you guys can't see this, but I wish that there was a way to share with everybody. There's this corn plant in one of the rooms, in one of the main soils instruction rooms at the University of Wisconsin, that was dug up by F.H. King, who, if you ever want to read a book that'll really change the way you look at agriculture, read F.H. King's Farmers of 40 Centuries.
Great book.
It's a great book. And he was one of the founding soils professors at the University of Wisconsin. And he travels around the Middle East or not the Middle East, the Far East, looking at agriculture in China, Korea, and Japan. And the reason the book has that title is because those people successfully farmed those soils for 4,000 years without depleting them. And it's kind of like one of the first forays into ideas about sustainability and what it takes to keep a soil functioning for a long period of time. So that's a great book. So we have this corn plant that he dug up, and you look at this root system on the corn plant, and this root system is like 3 or 4 feet deep, right? So this corn plant is able to access nutrients and water up to this very deep depth. And it's a very big root system. But I think for the farmers that are listening to this, if you think about pull up a lettuce plant, it does not
There's nothing there.
There's nothing there. Or even worse, pull up an onion. There's no root system there. And maybe if you're lucky, it gets to 6 inches. And so that's one of the things and this deals some with plant breeding, because a lot of times it seems like what happens is we select for the kind of traits that we want for these plants to be very edible, palatable, tasting good, and easy to harvest for humans. One of the things that apparently we sometimes select for also is not really great root systems.
Well, and frankly, in the plant breeding world, and I spent a fair amount of time in and around that world. They talk about the idea that you can only breed for so many things at once.
Right.
I mean, you can't select for everything all the time, because a plant has to choose where it's going to put its energy. I mean, if it's going to put it into making sugars to taste yummy, it's going to be putting less energy into developing a really broad and deep root system.
And that's so, I know we're getting a little off topic here, but that you can see that exact thing happening with these grafted tomato plants that people are doing a lot with, because what they're trying to do is take 2 plants that were bred for 2 different purposes, right? And then graft them together so you can kind of get both of those traits in one thing. So we're growing, we're taking a root stock that has a very vigorously growing tomato root system, which a lot of tomatoes don't have, and we're grafting it onto a tomato plant that makes really good fruit, because that plant that has a really good root system doesn't necessarily make the greatest fruit.
Right.
So there are things where people are trying to get around that, but this is a common thing with vegetables, is that the root system that we're dealing with is not really a very good root system, because we've selected for these other characteristics. And so that means that our fertility really in the field has to be optimal in order for these plants to be able to grow optimally, because they're not going to get themselves down really below 6 inches. And so when we think of soil building, the first thing that we always do with farmers when we start talking fertility is we say, well, we need to go out there and do a soil test, because you can't make any recommendations if you don't know, what you have in the bank to begin with. And the things that I look at the most when I look at giving recommendations to a farmer is I'm going to look at what their phosphorus levels are in the soil. I'm going to look at what their potassium levels are in the soil. And if this varies a little bit if we get out of the Midwest, but if we're in the Midwest, I can already tell you that your trace minerals are probably going to be low, especially for what what vegetables actually need. And you're probably going to benefit from a little bit of supplemental calcium as well. And so what we do is we take a look at where these like phosphorus and potassium numbers are in the soil test, and I want to fill that, bank up to optimal levels out there in the soil. And part of that is because I want two things to happen. One, I want the vegetables with their poor root systems to have access to absolutely optimal fertility. And two, when you balance the soil for what the plant needs optimally, you also often end up balancing it for what the biology in the soil needs optimally.
Now, and again, when we're talking about this, and I have to admit, I feel like as a farmer, and I spent 20 years in the field. I never really did a good job with the fertility and the soil side of things. I mean, I think we did okay, but when it came down to actually providing what the plant needed and providing the nutrients that the soil needed, I always felt like I didn't get it. So I'm gonna keep drill. I'm gonna assume that everybody else has the same problem that I do. And I'm going to keep kind of drilling away at that. So when you're talking about balancing the soil and providing these optimum levels of phosphorus and optimum levels of potassium, you're really talking about this again from the soil building standpoint, not from putting on phosphorus for the broccoli. You're talking about putting it on to make the soil so that you've got a foundation that you can now grow broccoli or tomatoes on with the addition of the right extra stuff.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
But I think the other key there is, like I said, what's really amazing is when you balance the soil optimally for, what's going to be optimal plant growth, you also end up with making it a really excellent environment for biology. And biology is really key because the soil biology, the soil microbiology, I mean, you have earthworms and things like that, but it's kind of this really interesting misconception out there that like earthworms are, what is going to drive your soil fertility. If you actually look at what has the biggest effect out there in the soil environment, it's actually microbes, and microbiology is really your biggest driver of soil health factors and good aggregation and things like that. And so these things are linked, right? So if for some reason the microbes in the soil are limited because of a nutrient, right? Because they don't have access to nutrient. They're growing and developing just like the plants are. But the thing is these soil microbes are also what has control of really that soil, the soil structure even. The structure of the soil, water infiltration, air infiltration, a lot of these things that we really need to be optimal too for the plants to grow. So there's this link there. When we balance the soil optimally for what the plants need, we also balance it optimally for what these microbes need, and we allow for maximum, there's one other ingredient that you need too, but we're setting the stage for like really high levels of microbial growth and work in the soil to create the kind of soil structure that we need to grow plants. The kind of plants that we want to grow to be able to harvest. So there's a very deep, intimate connection there. There's one other, and then this is where, when you say soil building, my mind kind of does two different things. What I've been talking about in my mind is that's a soil nutrient corrective.
Allen, we're going to stop for a moment to thank our sponsors for today's show. Friends, the Farmer to Farmer podcast bandwidth is sponsored this month by Second Cup Media. Second Cut Media provides technology assistance to farmers, and they help farmers to help the world. They offer workshops, coaching sessions, and retreats to farmers looking for help with their online presence, marketing strategy, and their business tools. But they're not your typical consulting firm. They don't promise high return rates, and they don't really set out to offer quick and easy solutions. It can be a little bit frustrating when you go and say, I want this big, beautiful thing, and Tom and Christy say, let's scale that back. And by the way, it's going to take a little bit more work than you expected, but the results are really there. Because friends, technology is easy, but building relationships is hard, especially when you're wrapped up in farming. So they're there to help bridge the gap between the two and show farmers how to grow their business in today's tech-driven world. SecondCutMedia.com. Take time, take a look. And friends, the Farmer to Farmer podcast is also sponsored by Purple Pitchfork, where I provide consulting, coaching, and education dedicated to helping farmers and their farm businesses. The way I see it, Purple Pitchfork is another tool that farmers can use to help themselves be more effective in their fields, in their businesses, and in their communities. I got into agriculture because I wanted to change the world, and I'm convinced that that change is only going to happen when farms succeed in meeting the triple bottom line of people, profits, and the environment. I've worked with clients ranging from 1 to 160 acres of organic vegetables. I've worked with a grass-fed beef marketing company, with food hubs, and with economic development agencies, and I would be thrilled to have the chance to work with you. Head on over to purplepitchfork.com to find out more about the work that I do and the tools that we've got available to you.
When you say soil building, what I'm usually thinking about is some sort of cover cropping regime that's going to be taking large amounts of carbon and plant matter and putting that back into the soil.
And really here we're talking about taking letting cover crops grow until they're nearing maturity and then putting them back into the soil. We're not talking about plowing in, 6-week-old oats.
No. Although you'd be amazed at what 6-week-old oats can do for your soil. Knee-high oats can really. There's a lot of energy in knee-high oats, and microbes can take that energy, and as long as they have optimal growing conditions, and then we feed them. Basically the energy that's in the oats, that's when they can really do some amazing things to your soil structure and create a much better soil environment for plant growth. This is actually really interesting because this is actually what I'm going to be talking about at the Moses conference at the end of February. I'm going to be doing a whole talk that centers all on like an introduction to soil kind of microbiology and soil health. And we're really going to go in depth during that time about how this all links up and works together. But the fertility side of it is, and the mineralization part of it really is a part of what needs to happen for optimal growth of these microbes and creating the system. And then the cover crops and turning kind of energy down into the soil is what kind of drives that. And that sets the stage. Those are the things that I spend a lot of time working with farmers. Now we're setting the stage so that we can get returns from when we fertilize a crop for a single growing season.
Okay. And really, and again, when you talk about fertilizing that crop for the single growing season, you're basically talking about adding to the soil the things that when you harvest the broccoli are going to be turning around and leaving the soil.
Yeah, that's a really great way to think of it. It's really what you're doing is we're replacing we're gonna replace what that crop is taking away. So it's kind of funny. I was up at a farm in Door County, and we had been invited back to this farm because they had used our program a couple years ago, and then they didn't use it for a year, and they called us because they said, "Oh, we really saw the results. When we stopped using your fertilizer, our yields declined." And we got their soil test out and we started looking at their soil test, and this is where a lot of this stuff kind of becomes counterintuitive. So their soil test, they had pretty low fertility numbers. They had low phosphorus, they had low potassium. And what I said to them is, well, of course our fertilizers gave you a response because you're at such a low level already. But my goal is to fill up the tank to the point where you don't notice the difference when you put the fertilizers in. because what the fertilizers are doing is refilling what those plants already have access to and are going to leave with.
Right, but you want enough of a basis that if you didn't do it, it wouldn't in a year it wouldn't matter. But it is that you want to continue to do it because that's what's going to keep your tank full.
Exactly. And then we get to cheat a little bit because we take this crop replacement and we put it right in the root zone, right at planting time, where the plants have access to it right away, and we call it crop fertilizer.
Right, with their little tiny 6-inch roots that they're able to get it.
Exactly. And so that's kind of the approach that's that full approach I take is, there's this soil. We take a look at your soil test. We want to do the soil corrective to make sure that your optimal nutrient levels, and then we look at what your individual plant fertilizer needs are for that plant for that growing season, and then we apply the fertilizer, to make up for what's going to leave your farm. And that is how and we've had really good success, and the farmers that I've been working with are really pleased with thinking of things in that way, because it also means, this is just kind of interesting to note, there's a lot of times where farms are really busy places, right? And we're at yes, I know, it's amazing. But we're also at the mercy of weather. And we've had this last year was probably one of the best growing years we've had in a while. And the 2 years before that were just really difficult years for farmers to get in, on schedule. This year we were delayed, but then after that, the growing season was a pretty good growing season. At least that's what I've heard from my farmers and what I saw in the field. But a lot of times, you look at get out there. Sometimes people just don't have the time to make that extra pass to put down a fertilizer
right
at the beginning of the growing season, and so, well, if your soil isn't already at an optimal level, well, you just shorted yourself. How much money did you just lose because you didn't apply that fertility if that isn't out there to help your crop grow to the optimal level? So also with this optimal soil balancing thing, part of what this is getting you is almost like an insurance policy. You can almost think of it that way, right? Oh, if I can't get out there in the spring, I still know the groceries are out there. And I can still go in later at the end of the season even and refill the tank.
Okay. And Alan, I mean, this is where too, when I also got a degree at the University of Wisconsin, and we took soils and we learned all about the importance of nitrogen and how volatile that is. So now you're talking about being able to grow a crop. You got your balanced soil. You're able to grow the crop without adding the nitrogen to it before you put that crop in the ground. When does that come in?
Oh my gosh, this is a very complicated question, and that would be the one thing. So boil
it down for me here, because I've been getting complicated answers about this for 15 years, and it's still, and I haven't been able to make it into something that makes sense. So I think we need to define the question a little bit more. So you're asking, when is it that I need to get a nitrogen application in for my crop? Yeah, that's right. For that first crop of broccoli, when it's been too wet, you guys are putting it in the field on April 18th. You just got into the field on April 15th. There's no time to run over the fertilizer. What do I do? Okay.
So first, this is part of farm planning, and we're going to talk a little bit about what this looks like in an organic system versus what this looks like in like a conventional system, because there's some pretty big differences there. So the first thing that I would say is, if I was in an organic system, I personally was always making sure that field was already prepped, with what those nitrogen needs were going to be the year before. But that's you can do that partially in an organic system, because when you're applying nitrogen to a field, it's always in some other form. It's nitrogen that's tied up in compost.
Right. It's wrapped up in it's nitrogen inside of a little poop molecule.
Basically, you're only going to get it out of a poop molecule.
Okay.
We've created a new kind of molecule today. Like probably some of the more soluble forms would be, say, like in a feather meal or something like that. But those are the things I'm only going to apply during the growing season. And so I'm already going to make sure that because I know that early field, I may not be able to get in with a nitrogen application, and that is the most volatile one. So my potassium levels could be really high, my phosphorus levels could be really high, my calcium could be good, my trace minerals could be right, everything could be lined up, but I don't know what, I need to make sure that it's got the nitrogen to carry through. So if I've, say, applied enough compost the year before, I know that it's going to be there, at the beginning of the growing season. The other thing, though, is that a lot of these crops, they don't necessarily need a shot of nitrogen right, as soon as they hit the soil, because the soil's always releasing a certain amount of nitrogen due to the organic matter levels in the soil and the way that those mineralize and release nitrogen to the crops. But they are going to need supplemental nitrogen, say, when they hit their peak growth period. So you still have another opportunity there in which you could get out there and say right as that broccoli hits the 3rd to 5th leaf stage, you could go out there with something like a pelletized chicken manure or feather meal, and you could put on another addition of basically a nitrogen fertilizer, and that's going to boost that crop to keep going. The optimal way, in my opinion, though, to really run nitrogen fertility, say on an organic farm, is to link that nitrogen fertility up with what your cover cropping regime is, because this to me is the best thing, right? Nitrogen is the only nutrient that I can get for free in quotes. There's still work involved, and there's still the cost of purchasing the seed, but you can grow if you have a crop of hairy vetch, say that you plant in September, after you've harvested last year's crop, and you can let that go all the way to mid-May, and you can disc that in, you've got 150 to 200 pounds of nitrogen out there.
Okay.
For the growing season. And so that's all that you've got everything you need to carry you through the growing season. And so that's one of the things I also spend a lot of time, working with people, is to design cover cropping regimes that are going to allow them to use legumes to build up their nitrogen levels. Which of course means
you got to have enough room to plant the cover crops,
or good planning. We did a lot with, it's amazing what you can do with undersowing techniques. So you can have, say you're growing even melons, and you're growing melons on plastic, but you've got a fairly decent amount of space in between all of these melons, bare dirt on some farms. Well, you can seed that down with a white clover mix, or we used to do that at final pass in most of our brassicas, like cabbage or kale. We would do our final cultivation, and I would have broadcast white clover seed out there. And so what that does is that white clover seed is going to catch, and it's going to start growing, and I'm going to go through and I'm going to harvest that cabbage field, and it's not that I have to suddenly plant that cabbage field to a cover crop. It's already out there. So a lot of this is about thinking about creative ways to work like a legume cover crop in as an underseeding, or in some way that you can get it in without taking too much, without having the amount of growing time limited because of what was in the field.
I think it does really mean, though, you got to have a crackerjack weed control system then too, because if you're not, if you've got weeds out in that field when that broccoli or that cabbage is coming off, now you've lost the ability, if your cover crop's already there, to till that stuff under. You've really got to have it be nice and clean when you're going in with that undersown cover crop.
That's a really good point. Wayne Meissen, one of the other consultants I work with, said the most profound thing I heard all year, because he said, what the biggest difference between a successful vegetable operation is and an unsuccessful one is? And I said, what, Wayne? And he said, weeds. And I was like, that is totally true, because if you think about it, and I think this is really good, and I'm always a little bit worried to say this in front of farmers for fear of offending them, but honestly, if you haven't figured out how to do weed control, then you shouldn't even be thinking about fertilizer, because your weeds will outcompete your plants for fertilizer.
Because they've got that big abundant root system that your lettuce plants don't, right?
Right. And water and all the other things that you spend all your time managing on the farm. If you honestly, as a farmer, It's kind of like I have this triangle, this plant hierarchy triangle that I show people sometimes, and it's and the bottom of it is water. It's kind of like, guess what? If you're a farmer and you haven't figured out how to water and get water to your crops, like, you don't need to worry about fertility or anything else because you haven't done your first job, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, especially if you're dealing in the world of vegetables.
Right. And I almost think that I need to put another bar in there that just says weeds, because it's the same thing. Like, weed control is such an important issue on most organic farms. And it's a lot. I mean, that's a whole nother podcast, Chris, just weed control. But I don't think weed control is as difficult as people make it. It becomes really difficult if you let weeds get away from you. But I look back at, I think one of the things I learned when I was at Gardens of Eagan was I learned about really good weed control. And I'm going to say that Martin Diffley was one of the guys that I have met in my life that is probably the very best at weed control. I mean, we had clean farms, clean fields, incredibly clean fields. And we could do this with just 1 or 2 cultivation passes. And when I tell that to a lot of the farmers I work with, their jaws just kind of fall open. But it's about, it's an art form. There's a lot about timing, but there's a lot about even just how you adjust your cultivator. There's a lot of people out there. There's a lot of farms that are doing cultivation where what they end up doing with the cultivator is bringing up more seeds from the weed seed bank than they're killing weeds. So there's a lot of subtleties in there, but weeds are this incredibly important indicator to me of on a farm about. Sometimes it's about how good the farmer is. If you walk onto a farm and that farm is clean and spotless, I know that this farm has it under control. And frankly, if they've got that under control, chances are they figured out fertility too.
Right.
So it's kind of funny. Those things are all linked. But
I think a lot of it comes down to, and I had a farmer that I was corresponding with just the other day say, that weed control, it's not about the tools and the implements. It's about the management. It's about understanding where weed control fits in your farm and prioritizing it and making it happen at the right times. And like you said, with the right kinds of adjustments. I mean, I don't think it's about having a budding basket weeder versus having shovels and sweeps. It's about having those things adjusted correctly so that you're able to get a weed-free field.
I think you're totally right. And what's really funny is I could say the same thing to a certain degree about fertility management, because I could give you I can come onto a farm and I can give a farmer like all the recommendations, the best recommendations I can come up with, the best fertility program that I can give them. But if the farmer isn't out there, being a careful observer about what's going on, being careful with their management of the way that they're going to manage their cover cropping, scheme to get, good amounts of nitrogen, then my recommendations could still easily fall flat, but it's because the recommendations might have been good, but the management wasn't there. And I think that's always the best managers are always the one, they're going to get it all right. They're going to get the weeds right. They're going to get the fertility right. And a lot of times it's this people with this like incredible attention to detail that I really respect, because I don't always have it.
Well, and Alan, I think the other thing that goes with that is, I mean, it's not that they're getting it all right all the time, but it's that they're getting each of the pieces right enough of the time that when something gets missed, it's not a disaster.
Yeah.
I think that's a lot of it. It's not like it's not like being a straight A student. Yeah. You can get all A's. You get A's in 3 classes, and you get C's in 2 of them. As long as you're not consistently getting C's in the same class year after year after year, or as long as you sometimes have that straight A semester, things kind of balance out, and you end up with a 3.8 or a 3.7, and you're okay.
Yeah.
I think it's when you're not getting most things right most of the time. I want to take you back. You started talking about this triangle that you like to use around, when you're talking about plants, talking about growing. And you talked about water being at the base of the triangle, but you didn't tell us what were on the other two legs. And I'd be irresponsible if I didn't come back and grab that.
Well, so I want you to imagine what it is it's a triangle, and it just has different bars. It doesn't have legs. It just has different bars going up. And so the idea here is like, unless you've done this level, you shouldn't proceed to the next level.
Got it.
And it's also like on the basis of this is the first thing that a plant needs, right? Like it needs this before it needs this. Like so it doesn't matter. So the first thing is water. The second thing is macronutrients. So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. But the idea here is I could have all the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in the field that like it could be perfect, but if I don't have the water, that's meaningless. Right. So that's kind of the idea here in this progression. So it's water, and then it's macronutrients. And then and this is just fertility. I could do this with all sorts of other things. I could do it with, soil health systems, organic matter, all sorts of things, but it's macronutrients, and then it's micronutrients. And then at the very tip, the little tiny triangle at the top is extras. And what I mean by extras is the things that people think are going to be the silver bullets for their farm, but and that they want to be the silver bullets for the farm because they haven't paid enough attention to the other things. But these are the things that can make they're kind of like finishing touches to a fertility system. And so this might be the addition of a little bit of like kelp into, your transplant water. So if I'm on a farm where, say, they haven't done a good job with their macronutrient fertilization, there's not enough phosphorus out there for the plant to grow. It doesn't matter if I put like a little bit of kelp as a root stimulant into the transplant water, right? Because it doesn't matter. The root's going to grow, but then there's nothing there for the root to access.
Well, and I think, Alan, this is, maybe a broad generalization, but you talk about those extras as being the silver bullets. They tend to be things that are, I think, relatively easy to manage. Anytime that somebody's coming in and telling me that they've got a silver bullet solution, the kelp in the transplanter water, or that one perfect implement that all they've got to do is buy that one implement and that's going to solve every problem on their farm. It tends to be very simple solutions. And solutions that don't require a lot of management. It's not that hard to pour a little kelp in your transplant water. Paying attention to the fertility and getting the soil test done and ordering in the fertilizer and having the tools to spread it and paying attention to that year in and year out, macros, micros. That's something that does take a lot of time and attention. And I think that's almost, I've said to some of my clients before, anytime they start talking about a silver bullet solution, it means that there's another problem that they need to solve first.
Yeah. And that's kind of, and that's why I made that triangle, was because I just wanted a real visual way to basically say, like, and what I say is, until you feel that you've adequately solved this problem, or you're willing to let somebody else come in and assess whether or not you've adequately solved this problem, don't even think about the next one, and I think one of the years I really saw that was, the drought year, the summer of 2012.
2012. Yeah.
Yeah. You found out who the good managers were, because they were.
And I just want to say, sorry, I'm going to jump in here, but it's not, it wasn't just the good managers, but what was so fascinating to me about 2012? The good managers they had record profitability.
And it's because, and it was record profitability because the only missing key was water, but the environment actually cooperated. It's something we forget. We live in the Midwest, and this is actually not the greatest climate for growing most vegetables. Because a lot of the vegetables that we grow actually are like desert origin or like really dry conditions. And they tend to get a lot of diseases when we don't have those dry conditions. And so what the environment did for us was it provided a huge amount of heat units, and it provided no way for diseases to take root. And so, what it ended up being was, if the management was good and you could manage the water, you had the perfect growing conditions. And I saw that exact same thing. And also weed control got easy. right? Because
it was the closest thing to farming in California that we've seen in the Midwest for 100 years. I mean, when you wanted to weed, you could weed. When you wanted to seed, you could seed. And as long as you had the water to put on your crops, like you said, that was the only missing piece. And so if you had made the investments in irrigation equipment and made the investments in irrigation systems, I mean, for managing that irrigation, and you had the water supply, you were golden that year.
And, and this is one of the things I feel like, I think maybe I don't even do a good enough job of this with farmers, is letting people know that there's all sorts of resources out there to help you do a better job with these things. Free resources, a lot of times through the like a local university. So, for instance, to kind of harp on this irrigation thing a little bit more, the amount of water that a plant needs per kilogram or per pound of dry matter that the plant produces is a pretty straight up average number. And I think it's I might get this wrong, but I think it's 200 liters per kilogram. Right?
Okay.
So you need 200 liters for every 1 kilogram of dry matter that plant is going to produce during the growing season. And the University of Wisconsin has what is basically like an irrigation calculator that you can have access to. So you can figure out, okay, this is exactly how much water these plants are going to need for this growing season. That's how much water it's going to need once you've satisfied the soil's need for the water, right? Well, right. And so that gets into some different ideas about what is the soil holding capacity and things like that. But most of the time when we go in, like when we start out in the spring, our fields are at field capacity already. We're waiting for them to dry out.
Right.
And so that for us here in the Midwest, that's not quite as much of an issue. And so, but you can actually figure out I'm, here, and I think this is where a lot of the smaller farms, this is where one of those things where really big farms get really good at this because they've only got 2 crops to manage. And really small farms aren't really great at this because it becomes this really complicated thing to do. But it's with the use of spreadsheets and things, we can set up systems where people can figure these things out a lot better. Or there's little cheats like a tensiometer is a really great tool for keeping track of where your soil water field capacity is at, how much water is actually out in the field for your plant to access. But there's ways too, I know that I'm going to get X 100 pounds of lettuce off of this field area, right? And so I could actually calculate this is how much water it's going to take to drive that.
Right.
And then I can actually use these calculators to know here's the amount of water that I'm going to have to apply during the growing season to actually get that level. Or you can do something like put a tensiometer out in the field, and that tensiometer is going to constantly measure how much water is out in the field. And a lot of those tensiometers even come with information about if I'm going to grow tomatoes, this is the level I want to see on the tensiometer. And so those are the kind of tools that make irrigation management and those kinds of things so much easier for people to do. But I feel like a lot of them are underutilized. I was talking to Richard Wild from Harmony Valley, and he told me something. I've told this to a lot of farmers. And he said that, for him actually installing, once he had done a lot of other things, he'd gotten his soils were healthy, and, he'd been irrigating for years. But when he put a tensiometer out in the field, he said, this changed the way I managed my farm. And he said, in really interesting ways, and especially with onions, because onions have really poor root systems. And so he said, I was already watering my onions twice as much as anything else on the farm, but I learned from the tensiometer that I needed to water them twice as much as that. And he said, and it made a huge difference in the amount of poundage of onions he was getting, because suddenly those onions were actually getting the right amount of water. And so, so here's this thing at the base of the triangle that looks like this really simple thing, right? It's just water. We live in the Midwest. It falls out of the sky most of the time, but, really paying attention makes a huge difference in the next one up the ladder on the pyramid. It's going to influence the way that those plants are able to access the macronutrients in the field.
Right, because that's how and this is that plant physiology piece, right? And we said we were going to come back to the plant physiology. I think we're kind of there. I mean, that's how the nutrients get into the plant, is they're flowing in with the water.
Right. I mean, the plant has access, nutrient-wise, to the things that are like basically in soil solution. It can do some different things to change the way the soil solution is set up by basically like excreting acids out of its root system. But really, it has access to what's in soil solution, and so there has to be some moisture, in the soil for the plant to even have access to those nutrients. And then what's really interesting about plant physiology, though, is what happens to those nutrients, like once they enter into the plant. And so the easiest way to think about this is, we have our macronutrients and we have our micronutrients, and what is their purpose once they're actually in a plant? So, nitrogen is really important for, plant leaf growth, but also for chlorophyll molecules. Every single chlorophyll molecule, which is why when we put more nitrogen on plants, they look more green, because chlorophyll reflects this green light. So the more chlorophyll you have in the plant, the more green light gets reflected. And every single chlorophyll molecule out there is a magnesium ion. The base of it is a magnesium ion with 4 nitrogen atoms attached to it. And so, nitrogen is incredibly important for, base at that very base level for building the solar panels that are going to harvest the energy for the plant. Phosphorus is really important for, basically like the energy system of the plant. So what you have is if you kind of think of it as a factory, you've got the nitrogen and the magnesium are building these solar panels. The solar panels are harvesting this energy. But then the next thing is we have to have a way to take this energy and kind of move it around. So you can kind of think of the ATP, the phosphorus, as part of this bigger energy molecule. But the phosphorus is like the integral part of this energy molecule. If you don't have enough phosphorus, it can't make enough of this energy molecule. And it's used to kind of shuttle the energy around inside the plant. And so what you end up with is, even if you had a plant that was perfectly green and gorgeous, right? If it doesn't have enough phosphorus, it's just sort of like, it's like that plant won't reach that next level, because plants are really smart. They're always figuring out for themselves, how much energy do I have to use? Do I need to put this, and how do I best use this energy that I have? And plants fruit often too early when they go into some sort of stress response. So I know I use broccoli all the time, but broccoli is a great plant to use to show this relationship. So, we had a field once where we went out there and we ended up having to do some tillage in wetter conditions early in the spring. And we ended up creating a pretty bad plow pan at about 6 inches. And we went out and we planted the broccoli. And the important thing to know here is that the ability of a plant to take up phosphorus, which is this energy, is highly related to the energy system of the plant. The phosphorus uptake is directly related to root growth because of the way phosphorus moves in the soil system. It doesn't move around a lot. And so the plant basically has to grow to go get it. And when you restrict the root system of a plant, well, obviously it can't keep growing and it can't find more phosphorus. Well, so what these plants did was they had plenty of nitrogen, they had plenty of potassium, but they suddenly ran out of phosphorus. And so they said, oh my gosh, we don't have a way to keep growing and keep creating more energy and move energy around in ourselves. We're going to have to flower right now.
Right, because now this is our last chance to stay in the gene pool. Let's get out there and make some babies.
Right. And so they buttoned, so we had this whole field of broccoli that buttoned. And the reason it buttoned was, if you want to trace it all back, it's because we created a plow pan because we tilled it too wet. But it buttoned because it ran out of phosphorus. And so if you don't address phosphorus in a field, your plant, even if it has plenty of nitrogen and potassium, phosphorus becomes the most limiting element. And it's just going to kind of shut down, and it's not going to be able to adequately use those other nutrients you have out there. What really gets interesting, though, to me, when we start looking at vegetables and how to think about vegetable fertility, is the relationship between what the fruiting body, what is the part that you're going to harvest on the plant, and what kind of nutrients is that going to have. And the nutrient that has the biggest effect on this is potassium, because potassium's role in the plant, one of its main roles is to help with sugar translocation. So now to kind of think about this again, so you get the nitrogen, magnesium chlorophyll complex. It's capturing energy. It's kind of handing that energy off to this phosphorus molecule. The phosphorus molecule interacts with some other things, and it basically creates sugar. So you've got sugar created in the leaf of the plant. But that's not where the plant needs the sugar, right? So one place that the plants actually need a lot of sugar is the root system, and we forget about this because the root system actually can't photosynthesize, right? It can't get any energy out of photosynthesis. So it's just like you and me. The root system actually has to burn sugar to keep working. So so the plant has to get the sugar down into the root system. And the other place it wants to get the sugar is towards the fruiting body, right? So let's take watermelon or tomatoes or any of these things with kind of these big fruiting bodies that, get a lot of sugar, or potatoes with starch in them. It's important to remember that starch is really just sugars hooked together. What happens is in order to get that sugar molecule to move over there, it has to hook it to potassium. And the potassium helps carry that sugar to where it needs to go in the plant. But what's really funny about it is once it gets there, it's stuck. The potassium can't move again. And so what happens is when we get plants that produce a lot of sweet fruit, highly sugary fruit, and even tomatoes have quite a lot of sugar in them. You end up with these plant parts that become very high in potassium. And this is why when you start looking at these different plant families, you get these differences in the potassium needs. See, it kind of starts to make sense when you look at it this way. And it gives you a way to, I like thinking this way because it gives you a way to assess on a plant what, even a plant maybe that you're not familiar with or can't find information on. It gives you a way to think about what that plant needs are going to be. I can already tell you, right, that the plant needs for potassium for lettuce are not going to be as high as potassium for watermelon. Why? Because I'm not harvesting something that's super full of sugar.
Right.
And taking that off the field. And so there's this direct relationship between potassium levels and the form of what you're going to take off the field. And then the other thing to also think of is how much of the plant am I removing? This is also really important from sort of a plant physiology point of view. So if you look at like a watermelon crop, what is it that you're removing?
Right. You're just taking the watermelon. Right.
And so you're taking this thing that's basically a ton of sugar. So I'm taking the potassium off the field, but I've actually left almost all of the nitrogen and phosphorus still there.
Right. Everything in the leaves and the roots are still hanging around.
But then if I go and I harvest lettuce, and then you run into this a lot. I run into this a lot with guys that maybe crop get up into that 3 crops of lettuce off the same piece of ground.
Right. People are doing like salad greens and stuff like that. The mixed salad.
Yeah. Like a great way to think about this is I tell them, that's human hay. That's hay for humans. Right. And it's really interesting because one of the fastest ways to run a field down in like a bigger, like on a dairy farm or something would be to harvest hay off of a field and sell it down the road and then not replace anything that just left the farm, because you're taking the whole plant. So you're taking a lot of nitrogen away. You're taking a decent amount of phosphorus off the field, and you're removing all this potassium all at the same time. So if I do that 3 times on a lettuce bed, I can now have removed just as much potassium as I would have removed with a tomato crop. But in addition to that, I removed more phosphorus than I would with a tomato crop and more nitrogen than I would with a tomato crop. And, guys will see this because they might get the first set of salad greens will be really great. Second will be okay. And the third really starts to peter out. And that's because when they get to that third level, they have depleted that field of nutrients. And so what they need to be doing is coming in and actually applying nutrients, before that third time, or really every time before they start, before they start a new seeding. And so just conceptualizing, seeing plants as, one way to think about this is your plants are, that compost that you're going to put out on the field, or your plants are the fertilizer that's in that bag. I mean, what's in that bag is literally going to turn into a plant. It's an amazing thing to think about, but then that's going to leave your farm. And this kind of gives you a conceptual way of thinking about, this is where these different nutrients are going, and this is how much of these different nutrients I'm going to be removing. And so that's also really great, like I said, when you run into a crop that maybe you haven't seen or encountered before, because you start thinking, I'm going to start growing Swiss chard, and I can't find any nutrient needs for Swiss chard. Well, what's really interesting is you could take some of the very same, you could run the fertility program for spinach over on the Swiss chard, because in effect, you're removing the same thing.
Right. Or it should be, and it should be, if you're thinking about things the way you're talking about it, it's probably going to be the same as it is for tatsoi or even for lettuce. It's going to be really similar because of the structure of the plant.
Exactly. And the same thing goes for a lot of root crops, rutabagas, carrots, all these different things. What these all are is basically like, those plants, those are starches down in the root system. And so, it's really funny. Again, one of the main things that you're going to remove with a root crop is potassium. Like, you aren't going to take the top a lot of times. Or the top isn't like a really, the carrot tops do not comprise like a huge amount of the biomass that you're removing.
Yeah, there's just not much there.
Yeah, for a carrot crop. But, you're removing quite a bit of potassium, because that's what those, there's sugars down there. That's actually, it's really fascinating when you start following the trail down. If you eat a carrot, in the middle of summer, it often doesn't taste real sweet, right?
Right.
Because it's all starchy, because the plant's just taking all that, and it's taking all this energy it's making, these sugars it's making, and it's linking them up to make starches. Well, your mouth doesn't taste starch. It doesn't taste sweet to us. But if you wait till it gets frosty, then what's happening is the plant is actually taking some of those starches and turning them back into sugars, because the sugar acts like a natural antifreeze for the plant that helps it resist getting frozen. And so the carrots suddenly start tasting much sweeter after a frost. So, I like thinking about things like that. Like, it's really, I'm looking at this carrot and, I taste it, it doesn't taste sweet, but I know that there's tons of sugar in there because it's going to come out late in the season. And if I know there's a lot of sugar in there, I know there's a lot of potassium.
Alan, this has been great. I feel like I feel like I'm coming away from this, and I say this with 25 years in the farming business. I'm coming away from this with an understanding that I didn't really have before about how all of these soil pieces fit together. I love how you just broke it down and made things really, I think, really simple, really easy to understand. So thank you for that.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad you find it helpful. And
so if somebody wants to get in touch with you or get in touch with Midwest Bio Ag to get a consultant out to their farm, what's the best way to do that?
You can do a couple different things. You can go to the website, which is www.midwesternbioag.com. All one word, all lowercase, no hyphens. You can go there, and there's actually a form that you can fill out. Under the contact us, kind of like called Find a Consultant, and you can submit that, and then that'll get passed on to a consultant at your area.
We'll have a link for that in the show notes. So if you didn't write down Midwestern Bio Ag, all one word, no hyphen, go to the show notes for this episode, which are going to be at farmertofarmerpodcast.com/Philo. That's /PHILO. And we'll have all of these links right there to make it easy for you to click on those. So, Alan, thank you again for being so generous with your time, your expertise, and your experience. This has really been fantastic.
Oh, thank you. It was a great time.
Friends, you can head on over to farmertofarmerpodcast.com for links and recaps for this and all of our shows. Thank you so much for listening in today. You can follow us on Facebook on the Purple Pitchfork page there. If you haven't already, please let us know what you think about this show on iTunes. Your reviews really matter to us. Again, today's show was sponsored by Second Cut Media and Purple Pitchfork. Have a great week and keep the tractor running.